I've had some success in this field. I feel very lucky, and I am still very much a student of haiku. I am not a scholar by any stretch. And at the end of the presentation, I'll have a couple of slides with some resources for further investigation, some journals, and some other things. And in my own work and in haiku in general, I take a very both and approach, meaning I write haiku. Many of us are familiar with haiku that are 17 syllables long, perhaps in 3 lines of 5 syllables, 7 and 5. I write in that format. I also write poems of far fewer syllables and different types of linear arrangements, and I embrace both openly. And for the purposes of our conversation today, I'll use the word haiku to refer to both haiku and senryu. If you're not familiar with the distinction between those two terms, we'll get into it a little bit. Basically, if your haiku takes place all in nature and there really isn't a presence of a human in your poem, it's more classically a haiku. If it takes place in the realm of the human exclusively, it's a senryu. And again, we'll look at some examples of both as we go along. So what I hope to offer today, this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are in this wonderful sort of sacred worldwide Sangha we have here, a brief overview of some of the common ingredients of haiku. And this might be completely familiar if you already are writing haiku. But if you're not, if you're just haiku curious, this is just a couple of introductory remarks on some of the things we tend to find in haiku. And I'll unpack these ingredients a little bit. And then as we walk through the poems, maybe some of the intentions and ingredients, I'll mention them as they come up. Share some work, obviously. And then a discussion and Q&A afterward. Maybe depending on time, we'll take a bit of a break, stretch, bio break. And then if anybody wants to write some poems or they have some already written they'd like to share in the chat, we can look at those together. And if possible, let's hold off on the chat or Q&A until I get to the end of the slides. But if you would like, please, if there's a poem that you want to go back to or you want to explore a little more after we're done, make a note of it or make a note of the page maybe that it appears on in the slideshow. And we're happy to go back to it. Okay, Chloe, first slide, please. Thank you. Okay, here we are. And the next slide, thank you, right here. So Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen says, we burn out not because we don't care, but because we don't grieve. And I follow Naomi Remen's work, her writings, and I came upon this quote, and it really spoke to the state of being that I was in when I started writing my book of haiku. But more importantly, I had started the Zen Peacemaker Order training and the socially engaged Buddhist training program offered by Upaya Zen Center. I had recently ended a contract with the juvenile hall system here in San Diego, where I was going in and offering mindfulness meditation sessions with youth, with children that were incarcerated. And I completely burned out on it. And I was feeling like I wanted to get back into some sort of process, some type of service at the margins as I was exploring Bertie Glassman, the 3 tenets, and his work and the margins and cracks of society. I felt naturally drawn to that, but I was also really struggling with burnout. And so when I started these training programs at ZPO and at Upaya, and we were encouraged to get out there and work at the margins, I had a visceral response of rejection of that idea until I stumbled upon this quote, and I realized I had not grieved. I had not internally processed what was happening as I bore witness to kids in juvenile hall and was trying to do something that I imagined was helpful. So I decided to turn inward toward my own suffering, to inquire and to grieve into it and through it. So haiku as a form of expression for me arose as a vehicle, a means to respond to a process of not looking away from my own suffering. And what I witnessed when I did that, and what I continue to witness today, and I would dare say all of us are perhaps overwhelmed with in our personal and collective experiences, is horrendous suffering that's happening all around us on so many levels. So to follow the three tenets, perhaps my compassionate action in this process for me was to write about suffering with the hopes that it inspires others to seek their own truth and to grieve into their own truth about these matters, and to let haiku be a vehicle for that. So this is kind of the nutshell that I was in as I approached this work. So before looking into haiku about suffering and how it might bear witness, let's look just a brief overview of some ingredients of haiku themselves. So next slide, please. Working definition, again, this might be very familiar to many of you. If not, it's just an introductory sense of a haiku. They're very small poems. They're very brief. They reflect the natural or the human world. And there's senryu, the word I used earlier, of a poem that really sits in the human experience, as opposed to perhaps a poem just in the natural world. But again, I use haiku to talk about both of these because there's a lot of overlap between them. Haiku capture moments in time that are mostly expressed in the present tense. They may have 17 syllables, and they may take up 3 lines or fewer than 3 lines. They may contain a seasonal reference, either naming a season itself or a kigo. An akigo word comes from Japanese, which there is a vast compendium of words that are designated as having significance in Japanese-inspired haiku. And we'll get into a few of those as well as we go along. And at the end of the slideshow, there's something called the World Kigo Database, where you can go and you can look up to see if a word you want to put into your haiku actually is a kigo or not. Not that it really matters, it's just an option if that's how you wanted to shape your poem. Haiku often utilize a structure that involves a phrase and a fragment, and we'll look at some of those. They use common everyday language, and perhaps most importantly, they reveal the extraordinary in the ordinary by creating meaning through a juxtaposition of images or parts. And we'll look at some of those ingredients as they show up in the work to come. Thank you. Next slide. Here's Matsuo Basho, 17th century founder with his peers, contemporary peers of this wonderful art form. And he says that haiku is simply another word that means haiku, is a putting together of things, a toi awasemono. And here is one of his most famous poems that we'll just look at as an example of how the putting together of things might work. And if we could all make sure we're muted, that would be great. Thank you. Old pond, a frog jumps into the sound of water. Old pond, a frog jumps into the sound of water. Next slide, please. This poem has been translated from the Japanese at least 30 times. And so there are slight variations that you will come across in English. But just if we look at the ingredients we just mentioned, some of the ingredients we just mentioned, how they might show up in this particular poem. First of all, old pond, it's a setting, it's a place, it's a natural world setting. There is no human presence in old pond. It's not my old pond in my backyard. It's an old pond. So it's a natural world setting. And this old pond is a fragment. We move on to the second two lines of the poem. A frog jumps into the sound of water. Jumps is a present tense word. And so we're at the pond, presumably witnessing the moment in which a frog does its thing. It jumps into the sound of water. Those two lines are a phrase. It's a two-line phrase. So we've got the fragment juxtaposed against a phrase. Excuse me. We have 3 lines. We have fewer than 17 syllables here. Everyday language and a compelling juxtaposition. And the juxtaposition here, I think, is really interesting. If you look at the frog jumping into, we assume it's jumping into the water because Basho already gives us a pond in the first line. But here the frog is jumping into the sound of water, which makes me step back and say, it's interesting. There's a different sense happening here, the sound of the water in addition to the water. And so that makes a juxtaposition that is much more interesting than if he had just said, old pond, a frog jumps into the water. No big deal. But by including the sound of the water or making that the unique turn, the turn of phrase, if you will, or the pivot in the poem, it gives it a little more depth and a lot more interest. Next, please. And one more by Basho, again, 17th century. And then Mayuzumi Madoka, a woman writing, a contemporary Japanese poet, born in 1962. The summer grass is all that remains of a soldier's dream. The summer grass is all that remains of a soldier's dream. And so here we are changing direction a bit. That first Basho poem, there really was no overt presence of a human, but here we have the word soldier, which of course alludes to war, human tragedy, devastation. And he's chosen to mix those two together. And here again, we have an overlap between what's happening in the natural world, the summer grass, and the human world, the soldier's dream. Grass is a Kigo word. Summer is our seasonal reference. And this poem, it kind of reads as a whole sentence, yeah? But I've seen this translated as summer grass, all that remains of a soldier's dream, which makes it a more distinct fragment and phrase poem. But I think it works beautifully here as well. And so now moving forward a couple of centuries, born in 1962, flourishing today, Madoka offers choosing a swimsuit. When did his eyes replace mine? Choosing a swimsuit. When did his eyes replace mine? So here's another shift. Yeah, we're shifting completely into the human realm here. There's no nature reference here at all. And she's also noticing in her own personal experience the moment in which she's now being objectified by a male gaze, if you will. There's a rich subtext here of her personal experience as a woman, her agency to choose a bathing suit, but noticing perhaps, she no longer has that agency because his eyes replace hers, which is a quite powerful statement, I think, to express in so few words. And it's really interesting to see in the lineage of where these poems first arose. They came to the West in the middle of the 20th century, but on their home turf, if you will, they're also really evolving in extraordinary ways and in very progressive ways. So at this point, I just wanted to allude to briefly about, touch on a bit of a philosophical debate that exists in the haiku realm, if you will, depending on where you are, what you're writing. I think it arises for us in the West. In the mid 20th century, haiku was imported. And there are folks that imported haiku at that time, and it really took on this character of the 17 syllable, perhaps 3 lines of 575, or Kerouac and others were writing in single line poems of 17 syllables at that time as well. And so there is this debate that it really should be one way or the other. And I really don't subscribe to one side of that dialogue or the other. Japanese as a language operates in sound units, and it is difficult to translate sound units in Japanese to syllables in English. The word haiku actually has 3 sound units in Japanese, and it only has 2 syllables in English. So there are fundamental differences between going from the Japanese and importing it into the West and letting the form flourish from there. And I think there's another philosophical debate around themes in haiku. What should we be writing about? And there are lots of wonderful poems out there that really don't reference the human world much at all. They're very anchored, beautifully anchored in nature, and they're transcendent moments of beauty, a poignant sort of passing and rotations of the season, full circle of life and death, real, and perhaps wistful nostalgia. They're beautiful, and there's some folks that think that that's really should be the focus for haiku. We shouldn't be leaning into Basho's Soldier's Dream. We shouldn't, maybe we don't lean into things that are, intentionally informed by a sense of social consciousness or responding to other areas in the human experience that are not so poignant, that are not so wistful. And I take these 2 poems as an illustration of how they can be both. And I also adhere to that both and through line, if you will, in my own work, so that thematic content is really another manifestation of both and. Haiku can be all cherry blossoms and dragonflies, or it can be about other realities of degradation and trauma. So let's look at a few more. Thanks, Chloe. Here's another shift from a 3-line into a 1-line poem. Speaking of degradation, new nesting material, the Target logo. New nesting material, the Target logo. And I was at Yosemite pre-pandemic, so maybe 8 years ago, and was amazed at the squirrels scurrying around the campgrounds, finding plastic bags and hoarding them, stuffing them into nooks and crannies around cabins and foundations as nesting material. Second poem, in a plastic bag, in a plastic bag, a plastic bag. Again, departure here. These are, little different ingredients, right? And so we're introducing repetition, especially in the second poem, for the effect as I read it. And these poems are so open to many interpretations, but one I would offer for these 2 is this ubiquity of plastic and how it's being used and not being used. And I feel like I'm caught in this vortex of endless poisoning through plastic bags and trash in this second poem. Next slide, please. Clear cut. A woodpecker forages sideways. Clear cut. A woodpecker forages sideways. Milk moon. A fawn licks the salt from a logging road. Milk moon. A fawn licks the salt from a logging road. These poems speak to the human industry of threatening the existence of our fellow species on the planet. A woodpecker foraging sideways is what happens after the tree is felled. And before it's dragged away out of the clearing, the woodpecker is doing what it can to sustain itself. Milk moon, moon is a very popular Kigo word, and milk moon refers to the full moon that happens in May. It's called a milk moon. And here we have a fawn, a baby, licking the salt from a logging road. So allusions here for me, milk moon, milk as a nourishing substance for the fawn who has trouble surviving in its natural world, is now trying to sustain itself by licking the salt from the logging road left over or as a process of us invading and degrading its natural habitat. But we're not saying, the logging road is being degraded here because the fawn is suffering by juxtaposing milk moon, fawn licking, logging road. We get the picture. We can read into the meanings of those various words and how they're juxtaposed over 3 lines to get a sense of the tragedy here. And we don't get to that tragedy until we get to the 3rd line in the presence of that word logging. Have the next slide, please. Out of body experience, the long drive out of Texas. Out of body experience, the long drive out of Texas. So here's a shift back. Our pendulum is now back squarely within human experience. And this poem has gotten lots of interesting responses from readers. One way to look at it, and it's all good. One way to look at it is out-of-body experience, the long drive. Oh my gosh, it's a surreal experience being in a car trip for 8 or 10 hours across perhaps unvariegated landscape to get someplace else. In this case, to leave the state of Texas to go elsewhere. But what also is on offer here is the intention of conveying an experience of what is now necessary for a woman who wants to access reproductive health care out of Texas, which is perhaps her home state. And part of that healthcare that she might want to access or might feel compelled to leave her home state in order to access could be an abortion itself, which is also a literal out-of-body experience. So these poems can resonate on a number of levels. There's no right or wrong way to read them. I did write this poem in the months running up to the overturn of Roe v. Wade. And it seemed to fit that particular moment in time. And I dare say it's a situation that is no longer marginalized now that it's become a norm for women to have to travel in order to access reproductive health care. Next slide, please, Chloe. Thank you. After my assault, the clouds still moving. After my assault, the clouds still moving. Black-eyed Susan, the garden she left behind. Black-eyed Susan, the garden she left behind. So these two moving into trauma, the realm of personal experience, truth-telling about difficult, violent personal experience. And I wanted to include these two poems because they not only reveal something that happened, a moment, I was hoping they also could convey perhaps a sense not only of trauma, but of resilience, of agency, and perhaps some healing. In the first poem, Susan offers, "After my assault," and that's in the past, but this moment happens in the present tense because she's noticing the clouds are still moving. And to me, that means, or signals a certain, okay, not everything has stopped or ended or has been obliterated here because of that assault. The clouds are still moving. So maybe I can still move. Maybe she can still move. Maybe there is some capacity for healing here. Black-Eyed Susan, the garden she left behind, another ingredient we haven't talked about yet, but is obviously word play, the double meaning between Black-Eyed Susan, the type of daisy, brown in the center with an array of yellow petals, with a woman named Susan who has a black eye. So there's that obvious double read there. But I chose to put this poem in the past tense to imply that that is over, that is behind her. The garden, the flowers, the same flowers might be in the garden and she left it behind. So maybe she found her way out of a traumatic, abusive situation. And maybe, hopefully, she's going on to recovery, something healing, something better and different. So as much as these bearing witness poems really, they lean into identifying and surfacing what arises around us that's horrendous. They also, I think, can be focused on resilience and agency as well. Next, please. Flattened boxes, a night squeezed out in the alley. Flattened boxes, a night squeezed out in the alley. This one also incorporating a bit of play between to flatten a box, to fold the sides of the box and you squeeze the air out of it. So squeeze plays both on the movement of the box to flatten it and also what it means just to squeeze out or to eke out an existence in the utterly uncompromising, horrific setting of a back alley somewhere. And your box becomes your makeshift mattress. Flattened boxes is the fragment. A night squeezed out in the alley is our phrase in this case. Something else I'll mention here, many poems that are shorter than 575 syllables, you still often see a shorter first line, slightly longer second line, and a shorter third line. And I'm drawn to those poems, even if they're much shorter than 17 syllables, but they have that, they resemble that other format in a visual sense. And I kind of like that. The second one here, wishbones, a dumpster diver goes under. Here we have another variety in the appearance of the poem on the page. It's 2 lines and not 3. I don't write many 2-line poems. There are also 4-line haiku. I don't write many of those either, but they work. They work perfectly well. Here's one. The poet wishbones, give it its own line. Second line is the phrase, a dumpster diver goes under. And what arises for me when I read this poem is this notion of hell, of having to dig around in other people's discarded trash to wish for a meal. Wishbone is something that we invest with hope and optimism in, right? Break the wishbone. But the dumpster diver going under, to me, resonates with passing, with death. Maybe they're not going to make it. You know, they're trying to sustain themselves in this horrific setting. And this is the moment when the dumpster diver is doing what they can. Will they make it? Will they get lucky? Will they not? Will they go under in a negative sense of those words? Highly effective and bracing. Next, please. Here we have another one-line poem. Back to school special on flak jackets and masks. Back to school special on flak jackets and masks. And this I wrote, beginning of the pandemic, when children were masking up to go back to school, if they were in school, or somewhere in the pandemic. And I wanted it to be a one-line poem because, and there are lots of reasons poets choose one line over others, and we can talk about that a little bit more if you'd like. One line, I wanted it to read like a banner across the headline of a newspaper circular. Back to school special on flak jackets and masks. And I could have put it on a second line, but I decided just to leave it run on. And some of that decision is made on, you're reading, you don't know what comes to the end of the poem until you get there. And so you're reading back to school special. Oh, it's about this stuff that's really, really difficult. And yet it's become ubiquitous in our society that we're, giving our kids flak jackets or bulletproof knapsacks in order to go to school. It's absolutely insane to me that this is where we are. And what I wanted to do here is play with another ingredient that we haven't talked about yet, and that is consonants, vowels, the K sounds, jackets, masks. I wanted it to be sort of hiss-like, black jackets and masks. It's not beautiful language when it's said out loud. And I chose those words intentionally to emphasize those consonants. Drops of snow, drops of blood on snow, bloom. Drops of blood on snow, bloom. New in this poem is the arrangement of the lines. The lines travel a little bit with each new line of the poem. And to me, that evokes a sense of blood blooming, seeping, getting larger. There's an image of the spread of the blood across the white snow, perhaps. The play here to this reader is the use of the word bloom, the double meaning of that, because it's bloom, it's a wonderful blooming rose. And here also we use that word to refer to blood blooming. And that's a very interesting juxtaposition of the meanings of that single word to really dramatic effect in this poem. So all ingredients don't need to appear in every haiku. We can selectively choose. I haven't included any, I don't think I've included any haiku deliberately that make use of a slant rhyme, a word that does not rhyme, but it's similar enough that it almost rhymes. Rhyming itself, of course, is not something that we utilize in haiku typically. But inadvertently, a resonance can happen or a certain musicality can happen, depending on what your intent is, what the sense that you want to evoke in the work itself. Next, please. Air raid shelter, the quieter callings of stray cats and doves. Air raid shelter, the quieter callings of stray cats and doves. This poem was written after the start of the war in Ukraine, and I wanted to juxtapose sounds. I didn't feel it necessary to say the sound of the air raid siren, but just using the word air raid and shelter invites us to recall the sound that air raid siren makes. And I wanted to juxtapose that with quieter callings, stray cats and doves, who are also present, who are also heard, hopefully, maybe in the quiet of a shelter, maybe in the quiet of a church basement. So there is that both end of the quieter callings, comforting sounds, with that other reality of the shocking sounds of war. My ancestors' weapon, made from wood of a tree, in blossom now. My ancestors' weapon, made from wood of a tree, in blossom now. Interesting play here between past and present. Presumably the poet is identifying with historical, centuries old, ancestors old war, violence. But the wood of the tree sustained, it lived, it survived, and oh my gosh, it's blossoming now. Perhaps in a sign of peace. There's a poignancy in reflecting on what's different now than centuries ago when there was incredible struggle. So I like this present moment in the poem, but it alludes to something deep in the past, which is obviously very violent and very disruptive. And these two poems, they're not quite 5-7-5 syllables, I don't think. Yeah, they're a syllable shy. There's some variation in the 5-7-5 format where you could do 4, 8, and 5 syllables, or some variety in those 3 lines. You know, and I think in my poem, I chose, I don't really want to make it an air raid shelter. I just left it off. I could have done that too. Sometimes, not always, sometimes I come up with a poem, I come up with something I'd like to express. What is it surfing? What are the juxtapositions I'm trying to work with here? And if I start in a 5-7-5 mode, I sometimes find myself thinking, okay, I want to use the word jumps, but jumping would give me the extra syllable that I need to make that line 7 syllables, just as an example. Or I might add an article or a preposition or something else. And sometimes that works beautifully. Sometimes I take a step back and I say, I feel like I've just freighted this line with little bits that might detract from what I'm really trying to say. So I write in both styles. I go from one to the other pretty freely, but it's just interesting to notice how aspects of the form, the structure, can be a help, can be an invitation. And sometimes for me, I find sometimes it's a hindrance. It all depends on the poem. Next, Chloe. Thank you. A few swallows, a knee, a neck. A few swallows, a knee, a neck. I wrote this poem after the killing of George Floyd. And I chose to format this poem in a vertical arrangement. The way that the poem appears on the page, I think, can lend a whole lot of meaning to what we glean from the poem. And in the haiku community, sometimes poets will call this type of an arrangement concrete. I don't have a better term for it. I find that a little confusing, but what that means, or meaning I take from that, is that sometimes the physical arrangement of the poem on the page adds extra meaning. So in this case, if a reader perceives that they're reading top to bottom, a few swallows, that could be a few swallows in a tree, right? And swallows is a nature reference. A knee, no, and a neck at the end. The top to bottom way that we take in this poem, my intention there was to, our visual descent through the poem is the same or similar to how I imagined that police officers need descended through space onto the neck of this person and murdered them against the street. That was the direction of the force. That was how the man was murdered. So I wanted to allude to that somehow by the way this poem appeared on the page. Other examples I've seen of this particular technique are in haiku, but also in another related form, haibun, which is a paragraph of prose, could be many paragraphs. But for example, a single paragraph of prose that is indented on one side to look like the overhang of a house and perhaps some steps. And the prose talks about a family homestead. And haibun is a form where you have prose combined with a haiku. The haiku can come before, after, in the middle, and it doesn't summarize the haibun, the prose section, which is often kind of like flash fiction, sort of. The haiku adds another layer of meaning to the prose. But this idea that the piece of work on the paper itself, the shape of the work itself, adds another layer of meaning to what's going on in the poem. So I wanted to bring one example or a couple examples in of that as another ingredient to play with. So next, please, and we're just about done here. So my haiku, your haiku, I think our haiku as artists and writers, we may be invited to bear witness, to turn toward things that we're surrounded by in the world that we might not immediately consider for haiku practice. And there are many, haiku is just obviously one lens to poetically express what's going on in the world that we might want to approach from a truth-telling perspective and a healing perspective. But haiku are about these moments. And there are so many moments that are really marginalized that we choose to look away from. So I think we're invited to contemplate moments of natural beauty, of course, and degradation. Moments of harmony, conflict, and solidarity. Moments of injustice, safe passage, and restoration. Moments of truth to power, resilience, and healing. Pema Chodron is one of my favorite writers. Bernie is as well, but Pema Chodron is also one of my favorite writers. And she one of her books, she invites us to get to know the places that scare you. And as poets, I think we can go to those places. Our haiku, our short forms, whatever we write, haiku is just one lens, but our haiku can arise from what we see, what we feel, and including the shadow sides of our individual and our collective experience of the world around us, both natural and human-made. We may bear witness to the complete reality with no part left out. No part left out. Next slide, Chloe. Finally, two more from Basho. Come out to view the truth of flowers blooming in poverty. Come out to view the truth of flowers blooming in poverty. And what does he mean by poverty here? I take that as a very open-ended word, but it is as loaded with meaning, and it's as fresh today as it was in the 17th century. Year after year, on the monkey's face, a monkey's mask. I'm sorry, my typo there. Year after year, on the monkey's face, a monkey's mask. This one in particular, for me, really invites me to sort of wake up, to to drop the scales from my eyes, to turn toward what I might rather ignore. And when I do that, I turn toward suffering. And when I do that, what is revealed is something that Vinnie Ferraro offers as, quote him here, the unmet grief, the unheld sadness, and the unmetabolized rage. The unmet grief, the unheld sadness, and the unmetabolized rage. And it's my belief that the vast space in these tiny words can hold all of these. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. I'll close with just a couple more slides. Here's some resources for folks that are interested in that World Kigo database. If you want to explore words that you want to use in your poems, you want to see what's out there, it's a great resource. Michael Dillon Welch is a wonderful haiku poet, and he is just so well read and studied, and a really authoritative voice on practices in contemporary English language haiku. His website is a treasure trove of essays about not only haiku, but all of its related forms. The Haiku Foundation and the Haiku Society of America, great starting places if you're not already affiliated, to find out more, to read a lot of haiku, to find out more and connect with other haiku poets. Haiku Handbook, Bill Higginson, Penny Harder, Lee Gerger, Charles Trumbull, Haiku, A Poet's Guide. And for the initial history of how haiku made its way and some of the foundational feelings and scholarship around what was imported, why, and how we evolved, Blythe, History of Haiku. Next, Chloe, thank you. Just a few journals here. And at the top of the list, I did not put on here, but I will invite Chloe to give a more detailed shout out, but I will mention right off the bat, ZPI Haiku, monthly haiku contest. I'm an editor. Bob Ertman is an editor. Sensei Bob Ertman is an editor. Chloe's an editor. Check out ZPI Haiku on the website. Send us your poems. Clark Strand, who is a master of more traditional or formal 575 haiku. I've studied with him. He's just a gem and really knowledgeable. The Heron's Nest, Frog Pond, Kingfisher, poetryp.com, Blythe Spirit, British Haiku Society, Tiny Words. There are so many journals out there. And if you surf up any of these, you will invariably find a whole other list of journals that these websites refer other poets onto. So have wonderful fun exploring. And I thank you so much. I think the last slide is just me, my email, my website. If you'd like to check out my book, go there. It'll direct you to Red Moon Press, the original publisher. It's now in its second or third printing, but we're now on Amazon. Regrettably, in my opinion, but that's the way of the world in one sense or another. But oh, everyone, you're so welcome. Thank you so much for your attention. Before we start the screen share, Chloe, if someone had a question about a particular poem, maybe you made note of it, ask me and I can read it again. We can unpack it a little bit more if people would like. So we've got about 45 minutes or so, 15 minutes. Do you want to take a quick break, 5-minute stretch break and come back or writing a little bit? Do folks have poems they've already written they'd like to share, to talk about? Or how about a show of hands if people either have poems or want to write? Yeah, I see Rhoda. Who else might be? Reuven. I can't see everybody. Chloe, can you? Oh, you're muted, Chloe. There you go.
Yeah, it looks like quite a few people have their hands raised. So
Okay, great. Okay.
yes.
Well, why don't go ahead.
Oh, would you like me to stop share now?
Well,
or-
let me ask the question. Does anybody have a specific question about any poem that we've looked at in the presentation? Because it'd be helpful to maybe visualize it again. If not,
It looks like Sweetwater Zen Center has a
Bobby, cool.
Hey, yeah, my bad. I didn't
Yeah.
change my name. Sorry. Thank you so much, Lorraine. That was super fun. I love thinking about the space between these words and the healing it can provide. It's really cool. There was one poem that really stood out to me just because when I read it, just in the moment, I had a completely different interpretation of what was being said. And so I just love the ambiguity and the space that some of these poems leave for the reader, right? So there was one
Yeah.
about choosing a swimsuit when
Yes.
his
The
eyes
Madoka.
replaced mine.
Yeah. Maizumi
And
Madoka.
yeah, and when I read that, like not even beyond a shadow of a doubt, I thought that he was choosing the swimsuit, and she was saying, like I used to pick out clothes for him, and now he's like autonomous and doesn't need me anymore.
Awesome. Yeah. Isn't that cool? I mean, it's all both and. They're really, yes, that there can be underlying inferences of meaning here. Some are more direct, some are less pronounced. But yeah, that's a completely valid interpretation of this poem as well.
I love it. I love it. Thank
Yeah,
you.
it's oh, you're so welcome. It's very cool. Thank you for offering that other that additional interpretation. It's totally valid. Rhoda says fewer birds, bees, butterflies. What do you mean, Rhoda? Fewer birds, carefully, no words. Oh, I'm sorry, that's your poem. We'll get to poems in just a second. I wanted to see if anybody else wanted to go back to a poem that appeared on the slides for any further discussion before we get into sharing other work. Any other, Chloe, see anybody else with a poem or that they'd like to go back to?
I'm not seeing anybody with their hands raised.
Okay, cool. Interesting for me. I made the point of sort of both and. It can be, cherry blossoms and dragonflies and butterflies, or really horrible dumpster diving and other horrible things. And I'll offer a Johnny Baranski poem. I didn't put it in the slideshow here. He died a few years ago. Wrote some really evocative work, and a lot of his work involves incarceration. And so speaking of dragonflies, here's a poem of his, 3 lines. In 10 summers, the convict's first visit, dragonfly. In 10 summers, the convict's first visit, dragonfly. And dragonfly is one of those Kigo words, cherry blossom, moon, butterfly. There are thousands of haiku using the word dragonfly that are in the realm of beautiful, transcendent, wistful, nostalgic moments in nature. But here it is, taking that Kigo out of that context and putting it into prison with him. But I read that as a symbol of redemption, ease, restorative, touch point of something else beyond incarceration, which is just beautiful, a beautiful juxtaposition for that poem. So yeah, both and. Yes, I will type that one into the chat. I will do that right now. If I can do this right.
Rhoda has her hand raised.
Sure, Rhoda, let me go ahead and get this other poem into the chat here first. What I'll do is I will put a slash in between lines because I always get the line returns wrong and it just goofs it up. So here we go. Let me mute myself while I do that. I will be with There's in 10 summers, the convicts first visit Dragonfly. But that's 3 lines. I just get the returns all messed up when I try to do that. So, okay, Rhoda, thank you. Please.
Well, thank you. All right, I wrote a poem while you were explaining haiku, and I put it into the chat, but
Could you read it for us, please?
I hit the return.
I think so. Each line is a separate entry, right?
Button 3 times, so the 3 lines came out as 3 different. It's a separate line.
That's okay. Why don't you read the whole poem for us?
In the
I think
one
Rhoda might be.
poem. Okay, but it's a separate entry, right? Each line is a
Yes.
separate entry.
That's good. Okay.
Fewer friends speak of bees, butterflies, carefully, no words.
Maybe put that one in the chat again. The poem I see here, it says, friends speak of gardens. Fewer birds, bees, butterflies, carefully, no words. That poem is a 5, 7, and 5 syllable poem on its own.
Trouble with your sound right now. No words. That's the 3rd line. 3 lines, 5, 7, 5.
Yes, yes, great. I'll read it. Let me know if this is okay. Friends speak of gardens. Fewer birds, bees, butterflies. Carefully, no words. Did I get that right? Bit of a freezing issue going on, Rhoda. Yes, it's a beautiful 575. Thank you. Thank you for offering it. I love the inclusion of the word carefully. And I love the turn of phrase. In the first line, gardens, I immediately, just this reader immediately goes to flowers, goes to greenery and things in the garden. And secondarily, I go to the butterflies and the bees and the little critters. So for me, that brought me deeper into the poem in my own perception. And carefully no words is very open-ended. It's very open-ended. I really like that very much. Thank you. Thank you. It's a beautiful poem. And 575 is so wonderful because you do have more space, more syllables, more word options. And so there's a little time to explore what is the arc of a line. Is that there's just more room sometimes. Other haiku, more freer form haiku. Sometimes I pick a single line for a haiku because it might only be 5 words. And to try to make 3 lines out of just 5 words, to me, it makes it really choppy. And I don't want it to be really choppy. I want there to be a certain flow, Sometimes isolating a single word on the last line of a 3-word poem gives it a lot of weight. It's like a landing place or a punchline for the poem. And if I want it to be more subtle than that, then I might put that one word, maybe it's an evocative word, I might put it at the very end of a single line. So it takes the reader, it's a gentler journey to get through the rest of the words. Oh, there's that juxtaposition. There's that word that has more than one meaning. Let me go back and read the poem again or a 3rd time. And then each time we do that, often the test of a good poem is like on successive readings, what more comes out of it for you? A wonderful teacher, Scott Mason, said to a class I took with him, he said, a good haiku allows you to enter the poem. I mean, these are tiny poems, right? But you're invited to enter. There's room for you to enter. Maybe it's the common language. Maybe it's a juxtaposition of words that we all might recognize. There's a place to enter the poem, and the other key ingredient is the invitation to linger, to stay. Is there more going on here in this small cluster of words? Is there an aha moment? Is there something going on here that invites me to linger and stay in this poem? You know, that the Basho poem, Old Pond, a frog jumps into the sound of water. That really invites me to hang around and say, wow, sound of water. That's really interesting. If it was just, as I said earlier, Old Pond, a frog jumps in, or a frog jumps into the water. I can get into that. I'm invited into that poem, but there's not a lot there to make me want to linger very long. So that's an interesting distinction, I think, in haiku. Is there a way into the poem, and are we invited to stay? Other poems, Q&A, discussion? Ah, yes, the author of the Convict Haiku. Ah, yes. That was Johnny. I'll type his name into the chat. Johnny Baranski. And I do believe Michael Dillon Welch, one of the resources on his website, Grace Guts. So I think I put the link there. By the way, I'm happy to share slides with folks after this, if that's helpful. I think he has an essay on Johnny Baranski on his website. But anyway, Johnny Baranski is the name of that particular poet.
Yes, and I'll send out a post-event survey, and I'll also add all of the resources.
Perfect. Yeah, so other questions, comments? Are folks already writing haiku, and are they looking at the larger world that's on fire, and is that filtering its way into your work? Yes, no, maybe. Is it something? I mean, for me, as I shared, I was really looking for some way to make sense of my burnout and my grief and my anger, my unmetabolized rage. And it's interesting, haiku is also an art form that encourages us to get outside, get out into nature, ideally, or get out in your environment. And what do you find there? What do you write about? And it's a very well-known practice of haiku poets to do ginkgo walks. That word is spelled many different ways. I'll put one spelling here in the chat. Literally ginkgo. And it's to be in nature and then to sort of rest in the awareness of images and things that you take notice of. And the poem kind of arises without a lot of ego, without a lot of saying, oh, I'm going to go and I'm going to write about robins in that tree over there. It's really a meditative type of practice.
Lorraine,
Yes.
we do have a question in the chat from Yo-Yu.
Where, okay. Oh.
What are your suggestions if someone is just starting out writing haiku?
Yeah, go to the Haiku Foundation, explore there. The Haiku Society of America is a membership organization, but lots of good resources. Haiku Foundation has various new to haiku essays with examples of different poets featured. Go to the Heron's Nest. Those issues, I believe, are free. It might be a membership journal. There are lots of free journals out there. I'd say most of them are online now. There are a handful that still do hard copies. And part of the reason they charge for them is because it's expensive to create a hard copy journal. There's a lot of stuff out there for free. go to Facebook and search up haiku groups. Pick a couple whose poems you resonate with and get on some mailing lists. There are haiku groups that are now starting to meet in person again. Everything went online during the pandemic, but a lot of groups are still meeting online. Originally, they were more regionally based. There are groups in Southern California. There's a haiku study group in San Diego where I live. There's one based out of the San Francisco Bay Area. Haiku Northwest is up in the Seattle. It's called, yeah, Haiku Northwest. There's one in Austin, Texas. There are groups on the East Coast. Some of it is regionally where you are, but a lot of them still meet online, and a lot of these groups will welcome members who are not geographically located where other members are, which is a wonderful gift to the field and to the community, because having haiku online is just great because you can ask questions of poets whose work you like and how do they function, and it's just a real gift of access. I'm hoping that a lot of that access will still be online. But, you know, you can look up, it'd be interesting, do a Google search, 10 most popular haiku poets in the world. And I know Basho and his contemporaries will come up, but you might get some American names and names from other countries there. Get a copy of their book and read it. Read as much as you possibly can. It's a great way to find out and be curious about what works in a poem. And as I said, Heron's Nest, Haiku Society, they will have some critique sessions where you can actually look at poems and what people, why they liked them, what they thought might be improved. And some haiku groups, membership groups, again, mostly on Zoom, will offer workshops occasionally where everybody submits a haiku anonymously, and then everybody takes turns appreciating it, saying what they like about it. Maybe something might be tweaked a little bit. It's all wonderful. And in my experience, the groups I've been in, all very supportive, not overly critical at all. I don't need anybody to do that. And it's funny, you know, I publish a lot of work, and I think part of that might be because I'm an okay poet. But I think part of it too is that a haiku journal might have 150 poems in it, 150 poems, and they're all teeny, right? So I publish much more haiku than any other short form poetry, and I write free verse, I write other things. I publish much more haiku because the odds are higher of getting into a journal because they have lots of pages and lots of poems can fit on a page. I mean, it's just the truth of it. And I still get rejected a whole lot as well, but you know, it's that mix. Obviously that mix, but. Yeah, I mean, I think haiku, like any creative art form, it's about choice making. And for me, the bearing witness lens was a choice to use. And at some point, I guess about 2 years ago now, I've been in San Diego for 7 or 8 years, but two, as my book was coming together and I was really focusing on this sort of flavor, if you will, in my work, I realized, ginkgo, get outside, look around, what's in your neighborhood, whatever it is. Look out your window if you can't actually get outside. And if you have a window, look outside, what's in your window. Or, like Isa, another 19th century, early 20th century, wonderful haiku poet, died of tuberculosis as a relatively young man. He was bedridden for 6 or 8, 9 months of his life. And so he wrote from that perspective. His poems did not arise from being out in nature. It was imagined. And they're wonderful work. So whatever's available to you, turn toward it. And what I realized from my own practice, my own haiku practice a couple of years ago, was that I live 15 minutes from my front door in San Diego is a horrific humanitarian crisis of families trying to cross the border, trying to flee drug lords, trying to flee their daughters being sold into sexual slavery to get into this country. And children are separated from parents, people living in cages. and I wasn't writing about it. I was not turning toward that at all in my work and in my, non-haiku Zen peacemakers order, work at the margins of society, the cracks, following Bernie's incredible example. And I had to take a step back and say, oh my God, that is the monkey's mask the monkey's face that's still wearing the monkey's mask for me. Because I'm not paying attention. I'm not awake to what's really going around me all the time. And what other choices can I make around that reality now that I know it's there?
Lorraine, thank you. We do have a question in the chat. Madison,
Yes.
do you mind speaking more about ginkgo walks? Not sure if
Yes.
you were about to add more about writing without ego and the meditative ability to let go and notice what arises.
Whoa, thank you. That is its own, all of that whole ball of wax right there is its own practice, right? How to be in an experience perhaps without the filter of, well, what do I feel about this experience? What do I want to say about this experience of this a one-legged bird struggling to maintain its balance on this branch over here? Or there is this invitation, and as part of my practice when I write haiku is to say, okay, is there just one meaning to this poem? And is there just one meaning because this is how I feel about it and I want to make sure that that gets across? And that can lean into coming up with work that's more like an aphorism than a juxtaposition of images or something that makes a political statement quite overtly. And I think there's a time and place for that. And I think it's an edge, I think, as poets that want to write about suffering, speaking truth to it means you're walking that edge between what it is and how we feel about it. And how we feel about it, I guess we could call that an ego interpretation, ego statement. And the ginkgo walk as an umbrella for haiku practice, I think its inception and the way I've experienced it as a poet is to just be in nature and try not to have any opinions or assumptions about what's happening around you. And if you can take off that filter for moments at a time, wow, maybe there'll be an insight that arises from the pattern of the way the sun is hitting the moss on this rock over here. And I'll write down all those words and I'll just leave it alone. And then I'll turn my attention to something else. Like, oh my God, this pain in my back, whatever it is. And I'll write a bunch of words about that. And it's like collecting all of these moments of experience. And then sometimes during the ginkgo itself, it works great for some poets. I kind of like to collect all of that data, all of those momentary noticings. And I write them all down, and then I take it away, and then I let some time go by and I sit with it. And then I remember that moment and what I jotted down. And sometimes something else will come to mind. It will remind me of an experience I had as a small child, or it'll remind me of something else. It will come back to me in a way. And many of the poems that I shared had I in them, like Susan Birch's poem, or after my assault, very personal statement there. But the intention behind that, personhood in that poem was to draw it into a more universally relatable context of who else has been assaulted, right? It speaks not only to the individual's experience, but it can have a larger appeal. So say on the ginkgo, there's the moss, the sun, the pattern that the sun makes on the moss on the stone. I take that away. A couple days later, I go back to it. Maybe I'll, come up with some type of resonating, memory from my childhood. Maybe not. I might. And it might make an interesting haiku if I juxtapose something about that memory with that moment in time, the pattern of the sun, or I might say, nah, this maybe what's going on here needs to be a longer piece. It needs to be a tanka, which is a 5-line exploration of the form, slightly different, or maybe it needs to be a haibun, a prose, a section of story where I talk about my childhood with a haiku that adds some meaning to it. I mean, it all kind of depends on the richness. And sometimes I've read poems after doing ginkgos with groups where a poet comes back and writes about the lack of what came up during a ginkgo, which is also interesting, right? There are moments of realizing, I'm not getting anything here. And that can become a very interesting poem because you're writing about the process of writing the poem, which is kind of a whole other genre of haiku expression. So yeah, it's my own, I haven't been successful in going into nature and meditating. Sometimes I can make notes of what comes up, but that tends to drag me out of the meditative moment. But if I go in thinking, okay, ginkgo, I'm tuning into nature, what's being revealed to me, I think it's a different, for me anyway, it's just a slightly different type of a meditative state or meditative practice. But I know folks, and I've heard them talk about really being in that oneness with everything, and this stuff just arises. And I think it's just really cool and miraculous. So I don't know if that's the question or not, but thank you. Any follow-up comments or on that or anything else?
Can I share one?
Of course.
Unfortunately, my connection was unstable. I was going in and out, in and out. But this, I'll just read it. Early morning chill, alone, so deep in the bones, chipped blue teacup.
Ooh, I'll type that in the chat for you, Royval, if you don't mind, so we can all get a look at it. What's
Sure.
the first line, please?
Early morning chill.
Oops.
And then second line, alone, dash, so deep in the bones. And then the third line, chipped blue teacup.
Yeah, I think early morning chill, alone, dash, so deep in the bones, chipped blue teacup. There it is. Great. I'm sorry I didn't do 3 lines, but so I didn't mess up the conveyance there. Wow. Really
Yeah, I'm
beautiful.
re-looking at it. I may even put the alone after the bones. So early morning chill, so deep in the bones, alone, chipped blue teacup. I think that actually is better.
Early morning
but I
chill.
don't know.
So deep in the bones, alone. Yeah, if you made that switch, you might not need the M dash at the end.
Right.
Bones, landing on the word bones at the end of the second, or bones alone, is a really evocative place. I mean, whenever we have 3 lines, usually the reader is invited to pause at the end of each line. But when we want to emphasize that, perhaps we add an M dash or perhaps ellipses when we really want to slow the reader down. I love the juxtaposition with chipped blue teacup, because that has a whole world of other references. And
Yes.
chipped, bone, alone. I'm surmising that the teacup is empty, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. But alone and emptiness seem to resonate for me there. And early morning, the teacup, maybe it's before you've made the tea. Yeah, I think I would also prefer alone at the end of that second line.
Mhm.
You could also, the poem I think would be fine without the word alone. Early morning chill, so deep in the bones, chipped blue teacup. Because so deep is intensifying and magnifying that sense of solitariness, right? Of solitude. So alone might risk repeating it a little too much. Because then you get to chipped blue teacup and there's age in that chipped cup because it's old, right?
Right.
And it's chilled perhaps. And so there's a real lovely overtone to the whole piece of solitude, perhaps a little pain, bones aching. And so I think the word alone, you could probably safely take that out and not lose any of the subtlety and the deep layering that's here. Cool.
Okay,
Thank you.
so it looks like Carla has her hand up.
Yeah, it would be maybe a question to Reuven. It definitely, this piece invites me in to look at it deeply. And I find myself asking, is the alone deep in the bones or is the chill deep in the bones? So by moving alone to the end of so deep in the bones, I associate it with chill. So that might just be a question for you as the author. When I see it the way it is, alone, so deep in the bones, I was intending that alone to be deep in the bones, like that solitude is comfortable to you.
Look, it looks like he might be having some
Yeah.
technical problems. So I don't think he can answer
Yes,
it.
yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah. Yep. And it kind of depends on how specific the poet wants to be about exactly where is that aloneness in the body, or is it psychological, or is it the presumably empty blue teacup? We'll see if he can, maybe he'll be able to come back and share a little bit more. Any other comments on this one, or questions, or other poems?
I do. I can't put my video on. Can you hear me?
Yes. Who is this? Is that Karen?
Yeah. I have a totally different take on it. I think you said comfort. Did Carla say comfort with the deep in the bones?
I'm not sure.
I got the opposite thing. If that's what she said, I got the opposite thing because it's a chill. It's a chill deep in the bones. And
Right.
the chipped teacup just, it's almost like a devastating deep in the bones chill. That's the sense I got from it, which is really very different.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's the both and of haiku, right? There can be so many interpretations, so many layers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, folks have had a little erratic sound experience this morning. The vagaries of technology. I love the access, and yet there are occasionally gremlins. Any other questions? Final thoughts? I will offer one. The longer I sit with this type of work, and I write lots of other types of haiku as well, but I do really, the pendulum kind of swings back.
Sadly, I've
Oh, there he is.
10 minutes of all the interaction because of my unstable connection.
Reuven, were you able to hear some of the comments? Oh, rats.
It's been very bad.
Yeah. The the last poem, the Year After Year, A Monkey's Face with a Monkey's Mask, to me, to write haiku and or create art in its broadest sense, whatever art form we practice or want to practice, haiku being one. If I'm not going to look at what's really so difficult out there and let that be a part of the art, for me, I almost consider that an aspect of spiritual bypassing. And I do believe art creating is a spiritual practice, whatever art form that is. And spiritual bypassing is kind of a loaded term, and it means lots of different things. But for me to not really look at the fullness of our common humanity, not cherry pick certain moments in nature that have a certain resonance, but to look at the fullness of our common humanity and let that inform my work, no part left out. To me, I felt like I'm bypassing something in my work and something in my expression here that really deserves a space on the page, a space on the haiku page. Obviously, there's lots of creative work out there that speaks very directly to human suffering, obviously. And this was just one particular lens. And with its association with Zen, and with a mindfulness sense in particular, it seemed like a really interesting way to explore the spiritual bypass question in my own practice of Zen as well. So I just wanted to offer that additional tidbit.
Well, thank you.
Of course.
Well, are there any other last minute questions before we close? Okay, so for those of you who had trouble hearing, I was able to hear it fine and I'm recording it. So you will have access to the recording in about a week. And I will also send out the resources that Lorraine's been talking about. So thank you so much, Lorraine. It's been lovely. And thank you everyone for your participation and your awesome questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor to share this work with you and to share the space. And yes, thank you.